The sweltering summer afternoon of 1992 began like any other in a peaceful residential neighborhood in Delaware, where adults left their doors open and children played within sight. No one noticed as an unusual silence gradually spread, only realizing something was wrong when a name was called over and over without a response. Neighbors gathered on neatly trimmed lawns, looking toward a family slipping into panic, while those first precious minutes slipped away quietly. At the center of that chaos, 3-year-old Linda Davis had just vanished from her familiar world without leaving any clear trace. When the decision to call the police was finally made, no one in the neighborhood could have imagined that brief moment would open nearly 3 decades of searching, silence, and unanswered questions. Years later, investigators would look back on that afternoon and realize that everything had changed forever in the short time it takes for a child to slip out of adult sight. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1992, Delaware was still considered one of the quietest states in the Northeast United States, where small neighborhoods operated on mutual familiarity, where children could run back and forth between yards without adults hovering nearby, where the concept of danger was more often tied to traffic accidents than deliberate crime, and that near-default sense of safety shaped how people lived, thought, and reacted to anything out of the ordinary. The Davis family was a very typical part of that picture, a stable working-class family, no scandals, no conflicts, with life revolving around work, school, and daily routines. Mornings began with preparing meals, midday with household chores, afternoons for children playing in the yard or around the neighborhood, everything unfolding in such a steady rhythm that few ever questioned the safety of their surroundings. 3-year-old Linda Davis was the center of that routine, a young moderately active child, accustomed to playing within sight of adults, familiar with the faces around her, and the short paths in the neighborhood, not the type to wander far or be hard to control, and thus often left in the care of a family member or acquaintance for short periods when adults were busy. The bond between Linda and her caregiver that day was built on familiarity and trust accumulated over time, with no signs of tension or unease, and it was this trust that caused the day's decisions to proceed on autopilot, based on the assumption that everything would continue safely as it had before. That day's activities were no different. Events flowed one after another. Linda moved through familiar spaces, adults kept an eye out habitually, rather than with high alertness, and in that context, an unusual element appeared in a very subtle way, not clear enough to immediately trigger a strong response. It might have been the presence of a stranger in the area, a behavior that didn't quite fit daily life, or a situation that caused a witness to hesitate for a few seconds, enough to spark doubt, but also enough to be dismissed by familiar self-reassurances not to overthink it, that this was a safe neighborhood, that everyone knew each other. This subjective reaction wasn't indifference, but the result of years living in a low-variation environment, where danger signals were rarely recognized immediately because they were too minor, too mismatched with the overall context. In that short window of time, Linda slipped out of direct adult oversight, not through a sudden or dramatic action, but through a very normal shift, a small step in familiar space, enough to break the chain of supervision that had been maintained by habit, rather than active control. When Linda's absence was noticed, the family's first reaction wasn't panic, but denial, instinctive searching nearby, calling her name, checking familiar spots, asking those around with the assumption that the child was simply out of sight. The spontaneous search quickly expanded as time passed without results. Unease began to replace initial reassurance, and information from those nearby remained vague. No one was sure where they'd seen Linda go. No one could confirm a clear direction. As familiar possibilities were ruled out one by one, the Davis family's daily routine was completely shattered, giving way to mounting panic with each passing minute, and in that context, the decision to call the police came as a last resort, after all spontaneous efforts yielded nothing, marking the moment Linda Davis was officially declared missing. The Davis family's missing child call immediately moved the case out of personal panic and into the official machinery of local law enforcement, and from that point on, every action related to Linda Davis was no longer based on family emotion or guesswork, but treated as a high-risk child disappearance. Initial information was received on an emergency basis, with core facts prioritized for immediate collection to determine whether this was a lost child, an accident, or signs of third-party intervention. Linda's young age, the short time missing, and the seemingly safe neighborhood setting quickly placed the case in the category requiring immediate response, without waiting for further verification. The first step was to lock down the last confirmed time Linda was seen, because in child disappearances, every passing minute directly affects the ability to trace. Investigators asked the family and primary caregiver to reconstruct the day's sequence, from when Linda woke up, ate, played, to the last moment her presence was confirmed in familiar space. Alongside establishing the timeline, the exact last location where Linda was seen was pinpointed, not just a single point, but a functional area, including entry-exit points, nearby public spaces, and short routes a 3-year-old could access in a very limited time. Authorities conducted a preliminary containment, dividing the area into priority control zones, while assessing the case's risk level, using standard criteria: victim age, self-mobility capability, time missing, surrounding environment, and any previously noted unusual factors. Risk classification wasn't speculative, but determined resource mobilization levels, because in those first hours, the difference between a runaway and an abduction might not be clear, but response needed to assume the worst case to avoid missing early intervention opportunities. In that context, rapid interviews were conducted alongside containment, focusing first on the Davis family and primary caregiver, with the goal not to find inconsistencies or assign blame, but to gather as much raw information as possible about Linda's behavior, habits, and interactions that day. Questions centered on seemingly minor details, like who had come and gone, any unfamiliar vehicles, whether anyone spoke to Linda, and adults' reactions to any initial unusual factors, because at this stage, witness memories were still relatively fresh and unaffected by speculation or external information. Alongside the family, witnesses living or active near the area were approached preliminarily, mainly to determine if anyone had seen Linda move beyond familiar boundaries, or noted any person or situation out of the ordinary. However, the information obtained remained fragmented, insufficient to build a clear movement path, reflecting the typical nature of disappearances in familiar spaces, where people usually only notice something truly stand out. From that initial data, the preliminary investigation direction formed openly, ruling out no possibilities, but not rushing to label the case, because prematurely locking into a specific scenario could miss key early clues. Investigators noted no clear signs of accident in the area, no direct evidence Linda had wandered far on her own, in such a short time, and while the unusual factors mentioned by the family before she vanished weren't specific enough, they couldn't be ignored. Therefore, the case was placed under active investigation, with focus on preserving the broad scene, maintaining traceability in the shortest possible space and time, and continuing to collect information from those involved, before their memories were diluted by stress, fatigue, and spreading rumors. At this stage, the investigation was still reactive, rather than deeply analytical, focused on not missing what could be gathered in the first hours after Linda vanished, because this window often determines whether a child disappearance can be resolved quickly, or enters a prolonged search with increasingly fewer solid facts. Once the preliminary investigation direction was set, focus immediately shifted from reconstructing accounts to surveying the scene, because in every child disappearance, the space where the victim vanished, is always seen as a rare source of objective data, especially when human statements are easily influenced by panic and unstable memory. The area identified as Linda's last seen location didn't resemble a typical crime scene. No obvious signs of disturbance, no items discarded unusually, no natural boundaries suggesting immediate accident, and no evidence of struggle or coercion. The scene survey thus proceeded in a state of both urgency and awkwardness, as investigators faced a familiar, clean, quiet space that in no way reflected the severity of the case under investigation. All accessible surfaces were checked for physical traces, possibly related to a 3-year-old's movement, from ground level, steps, shared walkways to low trees or obstacles, but what was found were only ordinary activity traces, insufficient to distinguish what directly related to Linda from everyday neighborhood activity. The quick physical evidence assessment revealed an unfavorable reality. No biological evidence, no blood, no fabric fibers, no foreign objects linkable to violence or accident, making the ability to determine Linda's direction of movement almost entirely dependent on indirect inference, rather than specific data. In that context, investigators had to acknowledge that the scene provided no direct clues to confirm how Linda left the area, over how much time, or with assistance or intervention from anyone, if any. The absence of direct evidence not only slowed the investigation, but also posed a major challenge to maintaining objectivity, because when physical data is insufficient, the risk of subjective hypotheses dominating the view of the case increases over time. Additionally, the technological context of 1992 imposed clear limits investigators couldn't overcome. The area had no surveillance cameras, no electronic data on movement or communication, no digitized records for quick tracing, and all information collection relied on manual methods, from scene notes to paper-based witness statements. Tools now standard in modern investigations, like location data retrieval, image analysis, or large database cross-referencing, simply didn't exist at the time, severely limiting the investigation's scope in both speed and accuracy. Under those conditions, reconstructing the events had to rely primarily on witness statements, from the Davis family, primary caregiver, to those living or active nearby, and this very dependence exposed the inherent weaknesses of human memory in emergencies. Statements, though carefully recorded, remained highly subjective, influenced by emotion, time-lapse, and unconscious assumptions, making cross-checking and verification far harder than in cases with physical evidence support. Some witnesses provided relatively consistent general timeframe information, but details began to diverge. Sighting times could differ by minutes, described directions weren't uniform, and previously mentioned unusual factors weren't noted by all witnesses in the same way. Investigators had to constantly balance maximizing what witnesses remembered with avoiding leading questions, because at this stage, any suggestion could inadvertently distort memory and create clues, not reflecting reality. The combination of no direct evidence, technological limits, and heavy reliance on statements made the initial investigation more exploratory than conclusive, forcing authorities to keep all possibilities open without prioritizing a clear direction. The scene, instead of being a solid starting point for tracing, reflected the fragile nature of the case, a child vanishing from familiar space, without leaving traces clear enough to determine cause or direction. In that context, every investigative decision had to be carefully weighed, between acting quickly and avoiding wasting resources on baseless assumptions, while time pressure continued to mount, with every hour since Linda was reported missing. In a crime scene that yielded no specific physical evidence, and with the technical limitations of 1992 making modern forensic tracing nearly impossible, canvassing quickly became the centerpiece of this investigative phase. regarded as the only way to fill the remaining information gaps, using human memory and observation. The investigative team systematically conducted door-to-door inquiries in the neighborhood, starting with the households closest to the last known location where Linda was seen, then gradually expanding to surrounding streets, shared pathways, and public spaces. The goal was not only to find anyone who had seen Linda, but also to understand the general rhythm of daily life in the neighborhood during the relevant time frame. Every contact was carefully documented, including the time, location, line of sight, and circumstances of the witness at the moment they believed they had seen or not seen anything unusual, because in child disappearance cases, both the presence and absence of observations can carry significance. However, as the number of statements grew, a reality quickly emerged. The collected information did not form a coherent sequence, but existed as fragmented, overlapping, and sometimes contradictory pieces on seemingly critical details. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Linda very close to the last time frame provided by the family, yet described different positions. Some recalled her near the house, others remembered her right by the shared pathway, and there were cases where they only recalled seeing a child who looked like that without being certain it was Linda. When pressed further, many statements began to reveal inconsistencies in timing, with discrepancies of just a few minutes, but enough to alter the entire understanding of the sequence of events, especially in a case where the initial missing window was measured in minutes. Additionally, not a few witnesses provided information only after having time to reflect, or after hearing others discuss the case, blurring the line between direct memory and indirect inference, and forcing investigators to continually question the reliability of each piece of information. Based on the statements collected, the investigative team began reconstructing possible routes, not as a single path but as a set of parallel scenarios, each reflecting a different interpretation of what Linda might have done or encountered in the brief period before she vanished. These routes were constructed based on the realistic mobility of a 3-year-old child, obstacles in the area, lines of sight from surrounding adults, and intersection points where supervision could be interrupted, while cross-referenced with each statement to assess fit. However, the reconstruction process quickly revealed that no single scenario fully matched all available data. Every assumed route required accepting at least one unconfirmed element, ranging from Linda wandering farther than usual to the possibility of intervention by another person, without leaving clear signs. It was during this phase that an unexplainable time gap emerged as the core weakness of the entire timeline, a short but critical interval, where no witness could definitively confirm seeing Linda, and no data was specific enough to determine where she was or what she was doing. This gap was not merely a few overlooked minutes, but a hazy zone where every hypothesis could coexist without anyone being strong enough to rule out the others, making it extremely difficult to prioritize a single investigative direction. During canvassing, many minor details were recorded, but could not be fully evaluated at the time, as they did not stand out amid the volume of information collected, and could not be immediately linked directly to Linda's disappearance. Descriptions of unfamiliar vehicles passing through the area, minor changes in neighbors' daily routines, or fleeting interactions between Linda and people outside her close circle were all entered into the file, but due to the lack of rapid verification capability, they were temporarily classified as secondary information. The underestimation of these details did not stem from disregard, but from the pressure to process large amounts of data in a short time, while the top priority remained finding leads that could lead to locating Linda as quickly as possible. At the same time, differences in how witnesses interpreted the same event complicated information synthesis, as each person recalled the incident through their personal lens, influenced by their position, relationship with the Davis family, and emotions at the time, resulting in the same detail being described in multiple ways. Investigators were forced to continually filter between what could be verified and what was merely reasonable speculation, between direct information and information contaminated by others' accounts, while still maintaining investigative momentum to avoid missing any remaining tracing opportunities. The result of the entire canvassing and timeline reconstruction process was an incomplete picture, in which the pieces existed but could not fit perfectly together, with a central gap still unfilled, accurately reflecting the fragile nature of the case, a child vanishing from a familiar space, without leaving clear enough traces to determine what happened in that decisive moment. The unfillable gap in the reconstructed timeline from canvassing forced the investigation to shift away from continuing to probe human memory and toward a more direct action phase, where the goal was no longer to explain what had happened, but to check every remaining possibility in the physical space around the area where Linda disappeared. The search radius was expanded from the initial residential core to adjacent streets, public spaces, vacant lots, grassy areas, drainage ditches, dense wooded areas, and locations a 3-year-old could reach or be taken to within a short time, based on the movement scenarios developed in the previous phase. The expansion was not random but organized in priority rings, with areas closest to the disappearance point searched first to rule out the possibility that Linda was still within a close radius, before allocating resources farther out to avoid overlooking key locations. To meet the demands of a wide area search, law enforcement mobilized additional personnel from support units and called for community volunteers, willing to devote time and effort to comb familiar terrain, in hopes of detecting any sign related to Linda. The involvement of volunteers significantly increased coverage, but also required tight coordination to ensure systematic searching, avoiding excessive overlap or leaving hard-to-reach areas unchecked. Search teams were assigned clear tasks, each responsible for a specific area, provided with maps, boundaries, and instructions on how to observe, mark, and report findings, no matter how small, because in the absence of data, any detail could become a crucial piece. Alongside ground search teams, police dogs were deployed to help identify potential movement directions for Linda, relying on their specialized scent tracking ability to detect traces humans might miss, especially in natural environments or areas with multiple paths. The use of dogs was conducted cautiously, selecting high-probability points linked to Linda's possible presence while accounting for factors that could reduce effectiveness, such as scent contamination from large numbers of searchers, weather conditions, and the time elapsed since the disappearance. Despite these recognized limitations, investigators still viewed police dogs as an essential tool in the search effort, as in the absence of direct evidence, every means that could provide additional information was considered. During the field sweep, items potentially related to Linda were gradually found and collected, not as conclusive evidence, but as supplementary data points to reassess current hypotheses. Each item was carefully recorded with its discovery location, condition, and surrounding context to determine whether it fit a scenario of a child moving independently in the area, or showed signs of external intervention. The emergence of these items brought both hope that the search was on the right track and further complexity to the overall picture, as they could be explained in multiple ways, from Linda dropping them while walking to the possibility they were moved by unrelated factors. Collecting and analyzing these items forced investigators to continually adjust their view of Linda's movement path, cross-referencing discovery locations with assumed routes, to see whether they formed a logical sequence or were merely disconnected points. In that context, the hypothesis of wandering off was seriously re-evaluated, based on a synthesis of factors such as Linda's age, realistic mobility, surrounding environment, and wide-area search results. The expansion of the search radius without finding a continuous path, consistent with a 3-year-old's capabilities, combined with the absence of signs that Linda had voluntarily gone farther than usual, gradually eroded the absolute persuasiveness of this hypothesis, though it could not be entirely ruled out. Each thoroughly searched area that yielded no specific result increased the pressure to consider that Linda may have left the search perimeter very early, while also raising questions about whether continuing to expand the search in the same manner remained effective. The large-scale search thus became a process that was both action-oriented and continuously evaluative, with every step accompanied by reconsideration of hypotheses and resource allocation, while still maintaining maximum effort to avoid missing any remaining possibilities. The prolonged nature of the search began to expose physical and emotional limits, not only for law enforcement but also for volunteers and the family, as initial hope was gradually tested by the lack of clear results. Nevertheless, during this phase, maintaining the wide-area search was still deemed necessary, because abandoning or narrowing it too early could mean accepting that the chance to find Linda in the area had been missed, a decision no one was ready to make while untested possibilities remained. The wide-area search that yielded no decisive results forced the investigative process to shift from fieldwork to a phase of analysis and restructuring of all collected information, in order to build the main investigative hypotheses best able to reasonably explain Linda's disappearance. Based on existing data, investigators began systematizing plausible scenarios, not in rigid priority order, but in parallel existence, because in the absence of direct evidence, prematurely ruling out a hypothesis could lead to serious errors. The first hypothesis considered was the possibility that Linda wandered off from her familiar activity area, based on her young age, children's natural curiosity, and the surrounding environment with many open paths. But this hypothesis quickly encountered problems when cross-checked against field search results, as no evidence showed a continuous route, consistent with a 3-year-old's mobility, in such a short time. The second hypothesis focused on third-party intervention, including both opportunistic abduction scenarios and possibilities involving acquaintances or individuals who had appeared in the area based on unusual factors mentioned before Linda's disappearance, and the unexplainable time gap in the reconstructed timeline. Alongside hypothesis construction, the process of narrowing down potential suspects was implemented cautiously, starting with individuals who had a real presence in the area at the relevant time. Those with legitimate reasons to be there, or whose schedules overlapped with the time frame of Linda's disappearance. This list included not only vague strangers mentioned by some witnesses, but also familiar neighborhood figures, because in similar cases, the line between outsiders and community members is often less clear than initially perceived. The narrowing down process was not intended to assign guilt immediately, but to identify individuals requiring further verification, based on position, time and actual access to the area and victim. On that basis, investigators checked alibis and schedules of each potential suspect, cross-referencing statements with time markers established from the family, witnesses, and canvassing results, while looking for any inconsistencies that might suggest concealment of information. This process occurred in a context where many alibis were built on habitual daily routines, rather than objective evidence, as technological limitations at the time made independent verification difficult, forcing reliance on the suspect's own statements and those of people around them. In many cases, provided schedules showed no clear contradictions, but also lacked sufficient rigor to fully rule out involvement, creating a gray area where suspicion existed, but could not be translated into specific legal action. The continued absence of physical evidence remained the biggest obstacle to sustaining a single investigative direction, as even a theoretically plausible hypothesis could not be prioritized without specific data to support it. Each potential suspect came with unanswered questions, but also with limitations that made full pursuit difficult at this stage. Throughout, investigators had to continually weigh focusing resources on certain directions against keeping multiple possibilities open, because concentrating all efforts on a single scenario could mean missing important leads elsewhere. The gradual elimination of possibilities occurred not through sudden steps, but through the accumulation of small factors, where each hypothesis weakened as it failed to explain some detail in the overall case. From the unfilled time gap, to the incompatibility between statements and search results. Some potential suspects were eliminated when their schedules were confirmed by multiple independent sources, while others remained under suspicion, but lacked sufficient grounds for deeper investigation, without depleting resources. This process clearly reflected the tension between the need for decisive action and the reality that every action had to be defensible under investigative standards, especially in a child disappearance case, where mistakes could lead to serious legal and ethical consequences. As hypotheses were successively examined, and some possibilities ruled out, the overall picture of the case did not become clearer, but instead revealed even more starkly the lack of core data needed for a conclusion. This uncertainty not only slowed the investigative process, but also created growing pressure on law enforcement, as each passing day, without significant progress, reduced the likelihood of finding Linda within the initial area, while increasing the risk that the case could become a prolonged stalemate. In that context, building, testing, and eliminating hypotheses became a repetitive process in which investigators had to continually return to the same body of data, view it from different angles, and accept that at this stage, not finding a clear answer was itself a result, reflecting the true state of the case. The successive weakening of investigative hypotheses, without the ability to translate into concrete action, causes the investigation process to enter a phase of wear-down, where subsequent efforts no longer produce clear breakthroughs, but mainly repeat previously conducted procedures with the faint hope that an overlooked detail will suddenly emerge. Leads continue to be received and checked, but most lead to the same familiar result. Information is not specific enough, cannot be independently verified, or when cross-checked against existing data, does not match in time, location, or circumstances. Some initially promising leads, after thorough review, show no direct connection to Linda's disappearance, forcing investigators to return to square one with the feeling that the workload has increased, but the value of the information obtained is disproportionate. Alongside the dead ends of leads, the reliability of witness statements also begins to decline over time, a process almost inevitable in prolonged cases, as human memory gradually becomes influenced by stress, fatigue, and stories circulating in the community. Some witnesses alter details in their statements, not because they deliberately provide false information, but because what they initially remembered gradually blends with personal speculation, or what they heard from others, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish what is direct observation from later interpretation. Other witnesses, while keeping the core of their story intact, cannot provide any new details of investigative value, rendering repeated interviews merely confirmatory rather than opening new directions. In this context, investigative resources begin to decline noticeably, not because the case is being downplayed, but because the system must allocate personnel and time to other cases that also require urgent response. The number of investigators directly following the case gradually decreases, search and verification activities are carried out less frequently, and remaining investigative efforts mainly focus on maintaining files rather than expanding the scope of inquiry. This creates a difficult-to-break cycle. The lack of results leads to resource cuts, and those cuts in turn reduce the ability to generate new results. The investigation drags on in a state of no progress, with periodic reviews of old data, meetings to re-evaluate hypotheses that have been considered multiple times, and a growing sense that what can be done with current means and information has nearly been exhausted. Each return to the files confronts investigators with the same reality: no new physical evidence, no new sufficiently reliable witnesses, and no strong enough lead to justify expanding the investigation in a different direction without additional input data. Meanwhile, time continues to pass, steadily diminishing the ability to gather accurate information. As the gap between the time of the incident and the time of investigation widens, memories fade further, the environment changes more, and potential traces become harder to preserve. Psychological pressure on the Davis family in this phase becomes heavier than ever, as they must live in a prolonged state of waiting, without clear answers, unsure whether their efforts are still prioritized. and unable to determine if the hope of finding Linda still has a realistic basis, or is merely a clinging wish in the face of an increasingly harsh reality. Contacts with the investigating agency, though still maintained, no longer bring the sense of progress they once did, but instead repeat known information, turning each exchange into a reminder of helplessness in the face of the case's limits. The family must confront pressure not only from worry about Linda's fate, but also from the community's gradually waning attention, as those around them return to their normal daily lives while they remain stuck at the moment Linda disappeared. This wear-down does not occur suddenly but accumulates over time, seeping into every investigative decision, every evaluation meeting, and every instance of the family waiting for a call that might bring new news, clearly reflecting the reality that the case is gradually slipping into a prolonged stalemate, where every subsequent effort must face the difficult question of whether anything more can be done within the bounds of what is already known. The prolonged wear-down in the investigative process ultimately leads to an administrative but highly significant decision for the case's fate, when the file on Linda Davis's disappearance is officially placed into archive status, marking the end of proactive investigation at the previous level. This decision does not stem from a new discovery or a definitive conclusion, but from the acknowledgement that, with the existing data, resources and tools, the likelihood of making significant progress in the short term is very low, and continuing to maintain the case at high priority is no longer appropriate given the system's operational realities. The file is reorganized, investigative documents are packaged, classified, and archived according to procedure, with the aim of preserving what has been collected for possible future access, if new information emerges, rather than allowing it to become scattered or lost over time. The cessation of proactive investigation does not mean the case is completely forgotten, but it reflects a clear shift from active pursuit to passive waiting, where any further action depends on whether new leads come from outside the system. Within the law enforcement agency's priority structure, Linda's disappearance gradually moves away from center stage, giving way to newly arising cases that require more urgent response, a reality unavoidable, given limited resources, and the constant emergence of situations needing immediate resolution. Periodic reviews, if still conducted, are largely formal, focused on ensuring the file remains fully archived and ready to be reopened if needed, rather than actively searching or tracing as in the early stages. This change also leads to a gradual reduction in interactions between the Davis family and investigators, as previous frequent exchanges with hopes of new updates become increasingly rare, and their content mainly revolves around confirming that no noteworthy information has been discovered. For the system, placing the case into cold case status is a necessary step to reallocate resources and maintain responsiveness to other situations, but for the family, it is the moment they must face a difficult-to-accept reality. Linda's disappearance is no longer being pursued with the same urgency as in the early days. The family enters a long-term waiting phase, where time is no longer measured in hours or days, but in indefinite extended voids, in which every phone ring or notification from authorities carries a faint hope that something might change. This waiting state has no clear endpoint, no timeline to cling to, and no specific roadmap for finding answers, causing the family's life to be divided into two parts, before and after the day Linda disappeared. While the system continues to operate at its own pace, Linda's case exists as a neatly filed but never truly closed record, suspended between investigated and unresolved, between hope and uncertainty. The case's departure from the system's priorities does not mean it loses importance, but reflects how organizations must make choices under constraints, where not every question can be pursued indefinitely through proactive measures. For the Davis family, this shift creates a new psychological pressure, different from the initial panic or the tension during the search phase, as it forces them to learn to live without progress, without new information, and without assurance that the case will be revisited in the near future. The family's personal efforts to keep the case from being forgotten become the only way to maintain Linda's presence in the communities and system's awareness, even though they understand those efforts cannot replace an official investigation with full resources. This phase marks the transition from action to waiting, from searching to preserving memory and records, accurately reflecting the nature of a cold case, not the end of investigation, but a prolonged pause, where time becomes the dominant factor, both obscuring old leads and preserving the fragile possibility that someday a new detail may emerge and force the file to be reopened. While the file on Linda Davis is archived and gradually recedes from the system's priority operations, in another state, a new life continues to form and develop without any sign indicating a connection to an unresolved missing person case. The child who vanished from Delaware reappears in an entirely different context, with a name, documents, and relationships that do not match her original origins, integrated into a foster family as part of a new order of life without apparent interruption. Growing up in a different state means that all the earliest memory milestones are tied to new people, spaces, and habits, where relationships are built on daily presence rather than blood ties or a broken history. The identity used in this life operates fully, from basic administrative procedures to social and school activities, without creating obvious conflicts in the early years. Because for a child too young to remember the prior period, the external consistency of the surrounding environment is sufficient to create a sense of stability. The foster family plays a central role in shaping the rhythm of life, providing behavioral models, habits, and values that the child accepts as self-evident, without questioning her origins beyond what is told or implicitly understood in the family context. The early years pass in relative normality, with developmental milestones occurring in familiar sequence, from first days at school, friendships, to forming a sense of belonging to a specific family and community. Throughout this period, there is no awareness that she was once the center of a large-scale search or a missing person file stored elsewhere, because that information does not exist in her daily living space and experiences. This lack of awareness is not the result of deliberate concealment in every moment, but the natural consequence of a life rebuilt from scratch with new data, where the past is severed with no opportunity to interfere with the present. Using a different identity does not immediately cause conflict, because the administrative, educational, and social systems operate based on the provided documents and information, and when those are consistent, they create a solid enough frame of reality for a person to grow up within it without suspicion. The foster family, as the primary anchor, provides not only material care, but also the emotional and social context that helps the child form her personal identity, even though that identity does not reflect her true origins. Family stories, whether simple or complex, are accepted as part of personal history, and the absence of clear memories from the period before appearing in this family makes the severed past invisible. In that context, life continues without clashing with major questions about identity, because all external signs reinforce the feeling that everything is proceeding in proper order. The lack of awareness about the disappearance does not mean this life is entirely without deviations, but those deviations, if they exist, are not clear enough in the early stage to break the forming stable structure. Instead, they blend into the normal fluctuations of the growing process, where every individual experiences differences and feelings that do not fully align with the surrounding environment, without necessarily attributing them to a specific cause. This other life thus develops in parallel with the cold case file lying dormant in the system, two independent streams that do not intersect, one being the passive waiting of the family in Delaware, the other the formation of a person with a new identity, unaware that her existence was once a major unanswered question for people elsewhere. Throughout this period, every timeline, every memory, and every relationship is built on the foundation of the present, without the presence of the lost past, and it is precisely this separation that allows life to continue fully in its own way. The new life, formed in a context completely detached from the cold case file lying dormant in Delaware, continues to operate according to a normal routine, where each passing day is shaped by the familiar activities of a family living stably in another state, with work, school, social relationships, and recurring habits creating a sense of continuity and consistency. Under the identity currently in use, the child grows through each developmental stage, participating in everyday activities just like any other child, from attending school, making friends, joining extracurricular activities, to forming personal interests and an initial awareness of their place within the family and community. These activities show no obvious signs of irregularity, because the surrounding systems, from schools, healthcare, to local administrative agencies, all operate based on the consistent set of information that has been established, creating an environment where the identity in use is not questioned. The relationship with the adoptive family becomes the central axis of personal life, where emotional bonds are built over time through care, discipline, support, and daily interactions, not significantly different from the structure of many other families in the community. This family serves as the source of stories about the past, even if those stories may be simplified, vague, or lacking in detail, but still sufficient to provide a frame of reference for the emerging personal identity. In that context, the lack of information about origins does not immediately become a prominent issue, because for a young child, what is present in daily life usually carries more weight than what is not mentioned. Questions about origins, if they arise, are typically explained in ways consistent with the adoptive family context, without leading to a need for verification or deeper investigation in the early stages. The absence of detailed origin information is thus enveloped by the outward stability of life, where basic needs are met and social relationships function smoothly. The lack of access to past records is not the result of a conscious decision on the individual's part, but rather a consequence of there being no clear reason to question what has been established, especially when all documents, procedures, and personal information remain consistent within the scope that the individual encounters. The education, healthcare, and administrative systems provide no signals indicating any discrepancy, and in a society that operates based on paper records, this consistency is sufficient to maintain the legitimacy of the identity in use. In family life, relationships are built on roles and responsibilities rather than biological history, and this contributes to reinforcing a sense of belonging, even though the foundation of that sense does not reflect the truth about origins. Key milestones in the growing up process, such as changing school levels, expanding social circles, or beginning to have a clearer self-awareness, occur within the framework of the current identity, making the severed past increasingly distant and irrelevant to real life. However, the lack of origin information does not completely disappear from inner life. It exists in the form of unnamed gaps, questions that have not yet been clearly formed, but still present as a feeling that something is not quite matching, though not specific enough to identify or pursue. These gaps are often dissolved into the normal upheavals of growing up, where every individual experiences doubt, self-searching, and comparison with others without necessarily tying it to a specific cause. Not having access to past records also means no opportunity to cross-check current information with old data, so any potential inconsistencies remain undetected during this phase. Life continues to operate in a state of relative balance, with relationships in the adoptive family playing a central role and the identity in use being reinforced through every social interaction, every signed document, and every recorded life milestone. This stability, though based on a foundation that does not match the truth, remains strong enough to sustain a normal rhythm of life, keeping the detached past from intervening in the present and allowing the life, under the mismatched identity, to continue, as if it were the only reality that exists. The outward stability of life, under the identity in use, gradually begins to show small cracks as the individual enters stages that require higher levels of information verification, and it is at these moments that discrepancies in documents start to surface in ways that are not serious enough to cause an immediate crisis, but sufficient to create a lingering sense of unease. Minor differences between various administrative documents, from the way personal information is recorded to inconsistencies in records related to birth time and place, are not always detected right away, because the system often allows a certain degree of flexibility when the basic data still aligns. However, as procedures become more complex and require cross-referencing across multiple sources, these discrepancies begin to appear more frequently, forcing the individual to pay attention even if they cannot yet clearly name where the problem lies. The lack of a complete birth record becomes one of the most difficult points to explain, not because it is entirely non-existent, but because what is available does not provide the seamless chain of information typically seen in similar records, creating a gap without a convincing explanation. In many situations, this gap is filled with practical or administrative explanations, sufficient to complete the procedure, but not enough to dispel the feeling that something remains unclear. Alongside document issues, irregularities in medical or civil registry records also start to be recognized, not at a level that directly affects health or rights, but in the form of mismatched details about early medical care history, routine checkup milestones, or information related to biological family. These irregularities are often attributed to incomplete archiving or system changes over time, a not uncommon occurrence in reality, but when placed alongside other discrepancies, they begin to form a pattern that is hard to ignore. The lack of access or failure to be provided with full past records makes these gaps even more apparent, because every attempt to cross-check information leads to the acceptance that some data cannot be retrieved or does not exist in the system in the usual way. Still, during this phase, the irregularities are not specific enough to trigger a deeper inquiry, because daily life continues, and the surrounding relationships do not demand clarification of origins in a forceful way. However, a sense of alienation begins to form and persist, not as a sudden shock, but as a simmering state, where the individual becomes aware of their difference from those around them, without being able to pinpoint the exact cause. This feeling is not tied to a specific event, but appears in everyday moments, when comparing family stories, when cross-referencing small details of personal history, or when realizing that seemingly simple questions about origins have no clear answers. This alienation does not lead to immediate action, because it is easily attributed to normal psychological fluctuations during growing up, but it persists as a stable emotional undercurrent, influencing how the individual views themselves and their place in the adoptive family. Relationships with the family continue to be maintained, but the information gaps begin to create an invisible boundary, where emotional attachment no longer fully aligns with knowledge of personal history. Efforts to explain the irregularities often stop at accepting the explanations already provided, because going deeper requires asking questions that are not always easy or encouraged in the family context. However, the accumulation of small discrepancies, from administrative documents to medical records, along with the prolonged sense of alienation, begins to create an internal pressure where the individual is no longer fully satisfied with vague answers. These irregularities, though not enough to disrupt life, quietly begin to change the perception of the identity in use, making it no longer fully accepted as before, but instead becoming a structure that needs deeper verification in the future, even though at this point, all signs remain at the level of personal doubt that has not yet been translated into specific action. The personal irregularities, accumulated from the previous phase, no longer remain at the level of vague emotion, but gradually transform into a deliberate process of awareness, as the individual begins to ask direct questions about their own origins, not as a reflexive outburst, but as the logical consequence of too many details that cannot be matched in everyday life. These questions initially appear sporadically, tied to specific situations requiring accurate personal information, but over time, they connect into a continuous chain of doubts, forcing the individual to re-examine assumptions that were once accepted as self-evident. Comparing personal information becomes a spontaneous but increasingly systematic action, from cross-checking different administrative documents to examining the consistency between family narratives and officially recorded data. In the process, discrepancies that were previously overlooked begin to stand out more when placed side by side, no longer able to be explained individually as ordinary administrative glitches, but gradually forming a repeating pattern. Differences in place of birth, timing of appearance in records, or the absence of key milestones in the infancy period do not exist in isolation, but reinforce one another in undermining the integrity of the previously accepted origin story. The lack of a reasonable explanation for these discrepancies creates an ever-widening cognitive gap, where generic answers no longer hold persuasive power, and silence or avoidance in conversations becomes a noticeable signal. Explanations based on circumstances or emotion, which once sufficed to maintain stability, begin to lose effectiveness when subjected to the pressure of specific questions and continuous cross-referencing between sources. The absence of a clear answer not only increases doubt, but also forces the individual to confront the possibility that the identity in use may not reflect the full truth, a possibility that is both hard to accept and impossible to continue ignoring. In that context, the process of comparing information no longer limits itself to documents or family stories, but extends to observing personal characteristics, from physical appearance and biological traits to inexplicable differences when compared to members of the adoptive family. These observations are not conclusive, but they contribute to reinforcing the feeling that there is a fundamental mismatch beyond the scope of random administrative errors. The inability to access full past records makes this process even more tense, because every effort to seek information ends at the same point: the lack of official data that can confirm or refute the emerging doubts. The repetition of this outcome changes how the individual views the relationship between themselves and the surrounding information system, realizing that what is recorded and stored does not always fully reflect reality. Gradually, doubt about identity is no longer an abstract feeling, but becomes a problem that needs to be resolved, because continuing to live with an unresolved major question begins to affect how the individual makes decisions and plans for the future. Long-term plans, whether related to education, career, or relationships, are all overshadowed by uncertainty about personal foundations, making the need to clarify origins more urgent than ever. During this phase, the decision to investigate further is not made as an act of opposition or disruption of family order, but as a necessary step to address a problem that has existed too long without a satisfactory answer. This decision is internal, arising from the need to understand oneself better, rather than from external pressure, and is formed after other options, like continuing to accept the ambiguity, become psychologically unviable. Investigating further does not mean having a clear direction ready, but only marks the transition from a passive to an active state in confronting questions about identity. At this point, the individual still does not have enough information to determine exactly what happened in the past, but the important change lies in the fact that the doubts have crossed the threshold of silence and begun to shape into a targeted search process. It is this shift that creates a psychological turning point, where identity is no longer a fixed concept to be accepted, but becomes an open question that demands verification and clarification, laying the foundation for subsequent actions in the effort to truly understand oneself and one's place in the world. The decision to delve deeper into personal origins quickly led to choosing a path that by that time had become familiar to many, but still represented a pivotal step for those seeking answers about themselves. Commercial DNA testing. This was a tool that was both easily accessible and promised objective data beyond the limits of administrative documents and human memory. The test was conducted as a personal action, without any specific expectations beyond wanting more information, and the very ordinariness of the process made it seem unlike a decision that could fundamentally change one's understanding of identity. The DNA sample was sent off, while life continued as usual, and during the waiting period for results, the existing doubts coexisted with the hope that biological data might either confirm the familiar story or at least help close the lingering questions. When the test results arrived, the first thing that stood out was not general information about geographic origins or common genetic traits, but the complete absence of any genetic matches with the adoptive family, a result that did not align with assumptions accepted for many years. This mismatch did not appear as a direct statement denying biological relation. Rather, it manifested through the lack of any close genetic connections corresponding to those presumed to be family members, a detail sufficient to confirm that biological identity and social identity existed in parallel without intersecting. This result did not carry immediate emotional weight, but required the individual to shift into an analytical mode, comparing, cross-referencing, and trying to understand the real meaning of the numbers and terms provided. Commercial DNA testing does not deliver final answers, it only opens up possibilities that need interpretation. As the data was examined in greater detail, other genetic connections began to emerge, not at the level of parents or full siblings, but as more distant relationships that were clear enough to rule out chance. These connections centered on a specific geographic area, with multiple indicators pointing to pedigree branches originating in Delaware, and information that created a strong collision with prior assumptions about personal history. The discovery of genetic links in Delaware was not immediately conclusive, but it provided a concrete anchor in space and history, where doubts about identity could begin to be verified with objective data. These pedigree connections, though distant, were sufficient to establish that biological origins were genuinely tied to a community and region where the individual had never lived or had any memory, highlighting the disconnect between the life being lived and biological past. Evaluating the significance of the DNA results became a process that was both technical and perceptual, as the individual had to distinguish between statistical information and real implications for their personal story. Percentages, degrees of relatedness, and pedigree charts did not automatically translate into clear answers, but they provided a robust enough data framework to rule out the possibility that prior doubts were merely subjective feelings. The presence of genetic links in Delaware shifted the focus of the inquiry from the question "is something wrong?" to what actually happened, and why does the biological data point to an entirely different place. In that context, the DNA results served not only as scientific evidence, but also as a factor forcing the individual to restructure their self-perception, realizing that the identity in use and biological identity could exist independently for many years without intersection. Examining the pedigree connections also raised new questions about the timing and circumstances that led to this separation, because for an individual to grow up completely detached from their biological origins requires specific events in the past, not merely random administrative errors. During the evaluation of the results, the individual was forced to weigh various possibilities, from less severe scenarios, like informal adoption, to more complex situations involving loss of contact or identity changes in unrecorded contexts. However, in any scenario, the DNA data made one core thing clear: the story of personal origins needed to be re-examined from the beginning, based on biological evidence, rather than continuing to rely entirely on what had been recounted or recorded in the existing system. This shift did not occur in a single moment, but through a process of reflection and comparison, as each genetic connection was placed within the broader context of pre-existing doubts. The DNA results thus became not just a set of data, but the convergence point of disparate signs that had appeared over many years, from documentary inconsistencies to prolonged feelings of alienation, now linked into a central question about identity. Assessing the significance of these results led to the realization that the inquiry could not stop at knowing there was no match with the adoptive family. It had to extend to identifying the real connection with the discovered pedigree branches, especially when they pointed to a specific area and potentially related to unknown past events. In that context, commercial DNA testing and pedigree data did not merely provide information, they created a point of no return in the journey of self-awareness, where previous ambiguity was replaced by a specific set of facts, though incomplete, yet sufficient to affirm that the identity in use did not reflect the full truth about biological origins. The genetic data pointing to a clear connection with Delaware meant the inquiry could no longer be confined to personal or family scope, as the DNA results had now crossed the threshold of private doubt to become information potentially directly relevant to an unsolved case in the law enforcement system. Transferring the DNA information to authorities was carried out as a necessary step to verify whether the discovered pedigree connections matched any missing persons records previously filed in the area, since only within an official investigation could biological data be fully and legally cross-referenced with historical databases. When the information was received, the initial response from law enforcement was not an immediate confirmation or denial, but focused on assessing possible relevance to stored cold cases based on criteria such as age, time of disappearance, location, and degree of match between the genetic data and previously recorded personal details. This evaluation process required reviewing a large volume of old files, many of which had not been examined in years, to determine if any case matched the characteristics of the newly emerged DNA data. Linking the new data to old files did not proceed in a linear fashion, as cold case files often exist in a fragmented state, with varying levels of detail and data quality, depending on the time and circumstances of the initial investigation. Investigators had to cross-reference genetic information with physical descriptions, timing and location of disappearance, while considering factors such as geographic distance and mobility in the specific historical context, in order to rule out mismatches and narrow the scope. During this process, DNA data was not treated as conclusive evidence, but as a starting point to trigger a re-examination of old files from a new perspective, where details previously downplayed or unverifiable with outdated technology could now be reconsidered. Continuous cross-referencing between genetic data and archived information gradually highlighted notable similarities with certain specific files, not enough for immediate conclusions, but enough to surpass the threshold of coincidence. These similarities compelled law enforcement to seriously consider the possibility that the new DNA data might relate to a long-investigated but unsolved child disappearance case, especially when basic factors such as age and timing of disappearance showed clear compatibility. In that context, the decision to reopen a file was not made hastily, but based on the accumulation of multiple factors, the reliability of the DNA results, the degree of fit with old files, and the potential to extract additional data using modern investigative methods. Reopening a file meant shifting the case from passive storage to active re-examination, entailing responsibility to review the entire prior investigation process, identify what was done, what could not be done at the time, and new opportunities that current technology could provide. For the system, this was a decision requiring careful consideration of resources and feasibility, as reactivating a cold case was not merely reopening a paper file, but a commitment of time and personnel to pursue a new investigative direction. For the individual providing the DNA data, connecting with law enforcement marked a significant transition in the journey of discovering origins. The process no longer revolved solely around who am I, but began touching on what happened in the past, and that question was now placed in an official legal and investigative context. The interaction between personal data and the investigative system created an intersection where biological information, administrative records, and investigative history began to connect, opening the possibility that gaps once unfillable by old methods could be re-examined in the light of new data. Reopening the file thus held not only procedural significance, but also represented a fundamental shift in case approach, where limitations that once led to deadlock were now challenged by the emergence of technology and data that had not previously existed. During this phase, all actions were carried out with necessary caution, as incorrect linkages or unfounded assumptions could lead to serious consequences, both for the investigation and for the individuals involved. Nevertheless, the convergence of DNA data, cold case files, and the ability to review with modern tools created a sufficiently solid foundation to re-examine the case, not from scratch, but from the point where past and present began to intersect through biological evidence. The official reopening of the file brought a fundamental change in approach, as the disappearance of Linda Davis was transferred to the cold case unit, the specialized unit handling long-dormant cases where time has eroded evidence, but has also created opportunities for new thinking and tools. The unit's first task was not to immediately seek new leads, but to go back through the entire 1992 file to understand exactly how the case had been investigated, in what context, with what limitations and assumptions. All original documents were systematically reviewed, from initial reports, scene notes, family and witness interview transcripts, to search diagrams, suspect lists, and hypotheses raised at the time. Each document was not only reread, but also placed in its proper chronological context, to distinguish objective facts recorded at the time of the incident from inferences formed later, under conditions of incomplete information. This review process helped the cold case unit clearly identify points where the original investigation had to stop, not due to lack of effort, but because the technology, resources, and methods of that time did not allow further progress. Alongside rereading old files, the unit conducted systematic cross-referencing between new data and old data, particularly the recently added DNA and pedigree information. The comparison went beyond confirming compatibility in age and timing of disappearance. It extended to checking whether hypotheses raised at the time still held up when placed alongside biological evidence. Details once considered secondary in 1992, such as vague anomalies mentioned by witnesses, the initial search scope, or certain suspects whose alibis could not be independently verified, were now brought back to the analysis table with heightened scrutiny. The new data allowed investigators to reassess the reasonableness of each hypothesis, not intuitively, but by examining its ability to simultaneously explain both the initial disappearance and the fact that the victim grew up completely detached from biological origins for many years. Based on this comparison, the cold case unit began re-establishing the case scenario in a more structured way, not entirely rejecting what had been done before, but rearranging hypotheses according to their fit with the current overall body of evidence. Scenarios such as wandering off or accident were re-evaluated with the central question of whether they could explain the absence of traces in large-scale searches and the complete break in identity. At the same time, scenarios involving third-party intervention were analyzed in greater detail, particularly the possibility that the victim left the area of disappearance within a very short window before the full search system was activated. Re-establishing scenarios was not aimed at immediate conclusions, but at creating a new analytical framework where each hypothesis had to consistently explain both old and new facts, rather than fitting only part of the picture. One of the most important goals for the cold case unit in this phase was to narrow the investigative scope, as experience with dormant cases shows that an overly broad scope is one of the main reasons investigations remain stalled for long periods. Narrowing was not done through subjective elimination, but through screening based on verifiability with modern methods. Suspects or investigative directions no longer compatible with the new DNA data were deprioritized, while elements previously unverifiable were elevated if they could now be cross-checked with technology or additional data. This process significantly reduced the number of scenarios to pursue, shifting focus from considering every possibility to pursuing possibilities that can be proven. The cold case unit's involvement also brought changes in information management and handling. The entire old file was digitized, standardized, and integrated into a modern data system, enabling faster and more accurate retrieval, cross-referencing, and analysis than manual methods allowed. This integration not only helped uncover potential connections among seemingly disparate data, but also allowed investigators to see the entire case as an interconnected system, rather than isolated pieces of information. In that context, reviewing the 1992 file was no longer a matter of reminiscence or inventory, but became the foundation for a new approach, one where the limitations that once turned the case cold were now re-examined through deeper analytical thinking and modern tools. The cold case unit, acting as a bridge between past and present, focused on transforming once passive old data into actionable information, while ensuring that every new assumption was built on rigorous verification and could withstand modern investigative standards. This phase did not produce immediate conclusions, but it restructured the entire case, clarifying what was known, what could not be known at the time, and what now had a chance to be illuminated, laying a solid foundation for continued investigation in a more focused and effective direction. With the scope of the investigation narrowed and the case scenario re-established on the basis of new data, the process moves into a decisive phase where doubts about identity are no longer merely analyzed, but must be confirmed through official forensic and legal procedures. DNA collected from the suspect individual is subjected to a comparison process under modern investigative standards, completely separate from any prior commercial testing, to ensure that any conclusions drawn have legal validity and can withstand rigorous scrutiny by the judicial system. Biological samples are processed in a strictly controlled environment, with clear chains of custody and documentation to eliminate any possibility of contamination or error, from collection and transport to laboratory analysis. The comparison is not only intended to confirm a general genetic connection, but focuses on establishing direct blood relations with individuals documented in the 1992 files, based on archived data, and additional samples collected in accordance with proper protocols. The results of the DNA comparison are evaluated by independent forensic experts responsible for confirming the degree of genetic compatibility according to strict scientific and statistical criteria, ensuring that conclusions are based not on speculation but on widely accepted scientific probabilities. Concurrently with the biological analysis, legal procedures are initiated to ensure that identity confirmation follows proper sequence and does not violate the rights of the parties involved, especially given the case's long duration and multiple changes of identity over the years. Investigators work closely with forensic, legal, and archival agencies to review the entire chain of administrative information, from original birth certificates and the earliest accessible medical records, to data generated during the period when the individual grew up under a different identity. The objective of this process is not merely to confirm a single DNA result, but to construct a complete legal picture in which biological data, administrative records, and investigative progress converge to produce a unified conclusion. When the official DNA comparison results are finalized, the degree of genetic compatibility exceeds the required threshold to affirm a direct blood relationship with the family in the 1992 files, eliminating the possibility of random coincidence and reinforcing the hypothesis that the individual under investigation is the child who went missing many years ago. However, in a legal context, a matching DNA result alone is not sufficient to immediately establish identity, as legal identity also depends on cross-referencing and adjusting relevant administrative records. Therefore, the next procedure focuses on formally establishing the identity of Linda Davis, linking the forensic results to the original archived records, while clarifying how the initial identity was interrupted and replaced over many years. Authorities review the original birth certificate, missing persons reports, and related documents to ensure that restoring the identity does not create unresolved legal or administrative conflicts. Establishing identity is not only about personal identification, but also a necessary step to update the case status in the system, shifting it from an unresolved missing persons file to one biologically confirmed. Throughout this process, investigators and forensic experts must balance scientific precision with legal caution, as any error could undermine the validity of the conclusion or cause unintended consequences for those involved. Once Linda Davis's identity is established on a forensic basis, the next step is to complete the identification file, a procedure that includes updating data in relevant systems from missing persons databases to personal records to reflect the newly confirmed reality. The identification file records not only the DNA results, but also synthesizes the entire verification process, including key investigative milestones, legal decisions, and steps taken to reach the final conclusion. Completing this file is as symbolic as it is practical, marking the first time in many years that the case has a solid foundation based on scientific evidence rather than speculation or hypothesis. For the investigative system, this is the moment when a scattered set of facts is reconnected into a coherent, verifiable narrative, enabling subsequent steps to proceed on a firm foundation. For the individual confirmed as Linda Davis, completing the identification file is not merely an administrative procedure, but the formal recognition of a biological truth that has long existed but was never previously acknowledged in a legal framework. This process requires ongoing coordination among departments, from forensic laboratories to archival and investigative agencies, to ensure that every detail is accurately and consistently recorded. When all necessary steps are completed, Linda Davis's identity is no longer a hypothesis to be proven but a reality confirmed by science and law, creating a critical milestone in the investigation where the question of who is definitively answered, even as questions about how and why remain. The confirmation of Linda Davis's identity through full forensic and legal procedures creates a mandatory shift in the investigative process, as authorities can no longer handle the case purely at the file level, but must directly approach the central individual in the entire chain of events. The person who has lived for many years unaware that they are the subject of an unresolved missing persons case. This approach is carefully prepared, not only operationally, but also psychologically, as investigators fully recognize that the information to be provided has the potential to completely upend the individual's perception of self, family, and past. The investigative agency chooses a formal yet cautious method of contact, ensuring that the information is delivered in a safe private setting with the presence of necessary professionals to provide support if the psychological reaction exceeds expectations. When the contact occurs, the focus is not on recounting the entire decades-long investigative process, but on providing core verified information sufficient for the individual to understand why they are being contacted, and why the identity they have been using does not fully reflect their biological truth. Investigators present the identity confirmation results directly, but in a structured manner, beginning with an explanation of the official DNA comparison process, the legal steps taken, and the scientific conclusion affirming the blood relationship with the family in the 1992 files. Information about the disappearance is provided in the necessary sequence, focusing on confirmed facts and avoiding speculation or unclear details to prevent confusion or unnecessary additional psychological harm. In that moment, the individual must confront a defining truth where the question "who am I" is answered in an irreversible way, while simultaneously opening up a series of new questions about a past that had never existed in their awareness before. The reaction to accepting this truth does not follow a fixed pattern, but involves layers of intertwined emotions from confusion and disbelief to the need to re-verify what has just been heard, because absorbing this information requires restructuring an entire personal narrative built over many years. Investigators maintain the role of providing information and clarifying necessary points while avoiding any imposition of emotional expectations, recognizing that the process of accepting and processing this truth will not conclude in a single exchange. Being confirmed as someone who was once a missing child is not only of legal or investigative significance, but also a direct collision with absent memories, where previously vague gaps now have specific explanations that are far from gentle. During the exchange, the investigative agency also clarifies the individual's role in the current phase of the case, emphasizing that identity confirmation carries no legal responsibility for events in the past, thereby reducing anxiety and preventing the individual from assigning themselves undue responsibility. Information is provided in a way that allows the individual to control the pace of acceptance, with emphasis that there is no pressure to make immediate decisions about next steps, especially those involving biological family. In this context, preparation for reunification is mentioned as a possibility to be considered when the individual is ready, rather than as an obligation or inevitable outcome of identity confirmation. The agency explains that all further steps, including contact with biological family, will be conducted on the basis of consent and careful consideration, ensuring that the individual's rights and psychological well-being are prioritized. This preparation is not only organizational, but also humane, as investigators recognize that reconnecting with a family that has waited for many years can bring both healing and significant emotional pressure. During the process of accepting the truth, the individual begins to realize that their life has existed in two parallel streams, one fully lived under a different identity, and another interrupted from childhood, but continuing in the memories and hopes of others. Reconciling these two streams cannot happen immediately, and the investigative agency actively avoids pushing emotional connection too quickly, instead providing necessary support resources so the individual can process the information in a way that suits them. The identity notification phase is therefore not seen as the end of a process, but as the beginning of a new stage, where the truth has been confirmed, but integrating that truth into personal and social life still requires time and space. For the investigative system, this is the moment when their role begins to shift from verification to support, with the goal no longer solely to clarify a case, but also to ensure that those directly affected by it can move forward safely and in a controlled manner. Notifying identity with caution and respect reflects the awareness that in cases spanning many years, truth is not merely an investigative conclusion, but a factor of profound weight in personal life, requiring an approach that goes beyond purely professional frameworks. The truth having been disclosed and identity confirmed through forensic means, creates the necessary but not sufficient conditions for a reunion, as a significant emotional and organizational gap exists between knowing and actually meeting again, a gap that must be handled with great care to avoid causing further harm to all parties involved. Arranging the meeting is conducted as a step-by-step process, not based on symbolism or emotional expectations, but on the practical readiness of individuals who have lived in two completely different realities for decades. The investigative agency acts as an intermediary, coordinating with psychological and legal support experts to determine the appropriate timing, location, and format of the meeting, ensuring that the first contact occurs in a controlled, private environment free from external pressures. Preparation focuses not only on logistics, but also on providing necessary information to all parties, helping them understand what has been scientifically confirmed, what remains unresolved, and what should not be expected immediately from a first meeting. When the meeting time is agreed upon, every factor is weighed to minimize emotional risks, as both the individual and the biological family carry accumulated expectations, fears, and unanswered questions from years lived in entirely different circumstances. The confirmation of the blood relationship, though already established by DNA results, is clearly restated in the meeting context, not to persuade, but to create a shared foundation based on verified truth, allowing all parties to enter the encounter with the same understanding of the biological connection between them. This confirmation serves as a practical anchor, where emotions can arise without being swept away by unverified assumptions or stories constructed in imagination over many years. Initial reactions from the parties do not follow a single script, but reflect the diversity of personal experiences, from shock and intense emotion to reserve and caution, as each person confronts the redefinition of their role in a relationship never fully lived. The biological family, having waited many years in uncertainty, must face the reality that the child they lost has grown into an independent person with their own memories, relationships, and identity, who cannot simply reintegrate into the old family structure. The individual, meanwhile, must process meeting people labeled as biological family, but experientially completely unfamiliar, forced to reconcile the newly confirmed biological truth with the reality that their life has been built on a different foundation. The first moments of the meeting are not about resolution or closure, but primarily about presence, where the parties attempt to observe, listen, and sense one another while maintaining a safe emotional distance. Initial reactions are often instinctive, expressed through body language, prolonged silences, or brief statements more confirmatory than sharing, reflecting the level of information and emotional overload each person is experiencing. The immediate emotional impact of the reunion cannot be measured by a single standard, as it includes both relief that the question of survival has finally been answered, and pain in realizing that lost years cannot be recovered. For the biological family, seeing the individual alive confirms that their hope was not in vain, but it also highlights the temporal and experiential gap they cannot bridge. For the individual, confronting the biological family evokes complex emotions from curiosity and emotion to defensiveness when accepting a biologically defined relationship without a corresponding emotional foundation. In the reunion space, support professionals maintain a role of observation and minimal intervention, only to ensure the meeting stays within safe boundaries and that all parties have space to express emotions without pressure to meet others' expectations. Refraining from forcing specific reactions is considered a key factor, as any attempt to impose an idealized reunion image risks damaging the later process of building a real relationship. The first meeting is therefore not defined as an ending, but as a fragile beginning, where biological truth has been confirmed, but emotional connection still requires time, patience, and consensus from all parties. What occurs in the moment of reunion cannot immediately resolve major questions about the past, nor can it automatically heal accumulated wounds over many years, but it creates a new reality, where the parties no longer exist in a state of assumption or vague waiting. The immediate impact of the reunion is thus dual-natured, opening the possibility of healing, while also exposing the limitations of achieving complete closure in a single event. In this context, arranging the meeting, confirming the blood relationship, and handling initial reactions are not merely organizational steps, but key elements shaping how the parties will continue to interact in the future, determining whether this reunion will become the foundation for building a new relationship or remain limited to confirming a biological fact. The reunion, carried out with caution and respect, reflects the awareness that in cases spanning decades, return is never simply a matter of going back to the starting point, but of creating a new point of encounter where past, present, and future must coexist in a structure without precedent for those involved. The first reunion, while carrying the significance of confirmation and opening up a new reality, did not close the story, but merely shifted it into a more complex phase, where the legal, social, and psychological consequences began to manifest clearly in the daily lives of those involved. Adjusting legal identity became a necessary but far from simple process, as it required reconciling the confirmed biological identity with the social identity that had existed for many years, each tied to its own rights, responsibilities, and legal history. Authorities coordinated to update personal records, adjust data related to birth certificates, missing person status, and other administrative systems, while carefully weighing considerations to avoid creating unnecessary legal conflicts for an individual who had lived under a different identity for a long time. This process was not just about changing documents, but also about determining how the two identities could coexist during the transition period, especially when the individual had built a life, relationships, and obligations based on the previous identity. Alongside these legal adjustments, relationships between the families entered a new phase where the simultaneous existence of the biological family and the adoptive family raised unprecedented questions about roles, boundaries, and responsibilities. There was no ready-made template to define how these families should interact, as each carried its own history, emotions, and different expectations for the future. The biological family, after years of waiting, had to learn how to approach an adult with an established life of their own, rather than the 3-year-old child who had disappeared, while the adoptive family had to face the reality that the relationship they had built was not negated, but was no longer the entire story. The intertwining of these relationships created sensitive situations where determining who had decision-making rights, who should step back, and who needed priority, became a continuous negotiation process that did not always proceed smoothly. In daily life, difficulties in integration began to become more apparent, as the central individual in the story had to adjust their self-perception in the context of new relationships, new stories, and new expectations. Integration was not just about meeting or maintaining contact, but also about merging two systems of memory and experience into a unified personal identity, a task that required time and ongoing support. Differences in family culture, daily habits, and ways of expressing emotions could become sources of tension, not because of direct conflict, but due to the natural incompatibility between what had been formed over many years and what had newly emerged. Additionally, external attention, even if unsolicited, could add further pressure, as the reunion story attracted interest and forced those involved to face questions or comments from the community, sometimes complicating an already fragile integration process. The long-term psychological consequences of the reunion began to surface clearly once the initial emotions subsided, giving way to deeper reflections on loss, the passage of time, and possibilities that could never occur. For the individual confirmed as Linda Davis, redefining herself did not happen in a single moment, but was a prolonged process where curiosity about the past intertwined with the need to protect current stability. Questions about who she might have become, if not separated from her biological family, or about the meaning of relationships formed in her previous life, could persist stubbornly. Not to seek specific answers, but to reflect the psychological effort to reconcile two divergent life paths. The biological family also had to confront their own psychological consequences, where the joy of reunion coexisted with the pain of realizing they had missed the opportunity to witness and participate in most of their loved one's life. A feeling not easily soothed by mere presence in the present. The adoptive family, meanwhile, had to adjust their perception of their own role, balancing between continuing to be an important source of support and accepting that they were not the biological origin. A realization that could evoke complex emotions related to loss, anxiety, and a shift in position in the life of the person they had raised. All these factors created a post-reunion picture that was far from simple, where healing did not occur in a straight line, but through alternating steps forward and backward, depending on the ability to communicate, provide support, and respect boundaries. The adjustments to legal identity, family relationships, and personal identity proceeded in parallel, influencing one another, and creating new challenges that could not be resolved by a single decision or event. The post-reunion phase was therefore not a closing chapter of the story, but a prolonged transitional state, where those involved had to learn to live with the confirmed truth while seeking a new form of stability that could encompass both the interrupted past and the ongoing present. In that state, every adjustment, no matter how small, carried significant meaning in determining whether the reunion would become the foundation for a sustainable relationship or merely a brief intersection in the history of people separated for too long by circumstances beyond their control. The post-reunion adjustments, while occupying much of the human attention, did not change the fact that from a criminal investigation perspective, confirming the victim's identity only answered the question of who, and had not yet touched on the remaining core question of who is responsible, and therefore, the process of reviewing the perpetrator was reactivated in parallel with the ongoing personal consequences. The cold case unit returned to the old list of suspects compiled in the early days of the 1992 investigation, this time, not to seek quick reactions or confessions, but to reassess each individual in light of the new established facts. Each suspect previously considered was placed back into the overall context of the case, cross-referenced with timelines, connections to the area, and access to the victim during the critical time period, while comparing what had been recorded before with modern investigative standards. This review process revealed an unavoidable reality of long-standing cold cases. Many suspects could no longer be fully verified as before, due to faded memories, witnesses no longer able to provide accurate information, or data that had not been preserved to standards suitable for long-term use. Assessing the potential for prosecution thus depended not only on the initial level of suspicion, but also on the ability to meet current legal requirements, where any prosecutorial action had to be based on evidence that could withstand court scrutiny. In that context, the absence of physical evidence became the biggest obstacle to definitively identifying the perpetrator, as the initial search did not collect biological samples or traces that could be compared using modern technology, and the passage of time made the possibility of additional searches nearly non-existent. Items collected, if any, were insufficient to provide new data, or had lost forensic value due to storage conditions and technical limitations of the time. This forced investigators to rely more heavily on behavioral analysis, context, and sequence of events, elements that were indirect and difficult to convert into specific legal evidence. Limitations due to time were not only evident in the degradation of evidence, but also in changes in the living circumstances of potential suspects, as some had moved away, completely changed their lifestyles, or were no longer able to be meaningfully interviewed. Additionally, legal and investigative standards had changed over time, making what was once considered sufficient to raise suspicion in the past no longer meet the requirements for prosecution. Re-reviewing old suspects was therefore more confirmatory than exploratory, aimed at clearly defining the boundary between what could continue to be pursued and what had to be accepted as unresolvable within the current legal framework. Investigators had to confront the reality that although the victim's identity had been confirmed and the personal story resolved, assigning criminal responsibility to a specific individual might remain out of reach due to the irreversible limitations of time. This process required a delicate balance between the duty to pursue justice and the responsibility not to create false expectations for those affected, especially the biological family, who might expect that recovering the victim would automatically lead to identifying and punishing the perpetrator. While reviewing suspects, the cold case unit also re-evaluated the entire investigative chain to determine if any untested approaches could yield new value. But most of these directions returned to the same limiting point: lack of physical evidence and the unavoidable degradation of witness data. Assessing prosecutability, therefore, did not end with a conclusive verdict, but with determining the realistic feasibility of next steps, based on what could be proven, rather than what could be suspected. The perpetrator investigation phase in this context reflected one of the greatest paradoxes of decades-long cases, when the truth about the victim's identity and fate was finally clarified. the question of criminal responsibility could not be fully answered. This did not diminish the value of what had been confirmed, but it set clear limits on the system's ability to remedy past wrongs when time had taken away too many necessary elements for justice in the strict legal sense. The conclusions reached during the perpetrator review led the investigation to a clear boundary between clarifying the truth and the ability to enforce justice within the current legal framework. Where statutes of limitations became a decisive factor that could not be overlooked. In cases spanning decades, especially missing persons cases from the early 1990s legal context, the timeframe for pursuing criminal responsibility for certain specific acts had expired, regardless of their moral severity or long-term impact on the victim and family. Evaluating statutes of limitations was not a formal step, but a detailed review of the legal provisions applicable at the time of the incident, cross-referenced with subsequent legal changes to determine if any basis existed for retroactive application. In this case, the limits of statutes of limitations created a solid legal barrier, making criminal prosecution for potential acts related to Linda Davis's disappearance no longer feasible, even though suspicions and possibilities remained at the investigative level. Alongside the statute of limitations issue, insufficient legal grounds further narrowed the system's scope of action, as prosecution standards required evidence proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a requirement that could not be met in the context of missing physical evidence and severe degradation of witness data. Reasonable investigative inferences, while valuable in reconstructing the story, could not substitute for direct evidence in the legal process, and this distinction became a key factor, delineating the boundary between investigation and prosecution. Prosecutors, when reviewing the file, were forced to make assessments based on the likelihood of winning in court, rather than on the persuasiveness of the investigative narrative, and in that context, what had been clarified was insufficient to meet the necessary standards for bringing an individual before the law. The outcome of this process was that the case was determined to be partially solved, in the sense that the victim's fate and identity had been clarified through modern science and investigation, but the question of criminal responsibility could not be officially answered. The concept of partially solved carried an unavoidable ambiguity, as it both represented a significant achievement in ending the prolonged missing status and reflected the system's imperfection in failing to complete the circle of justice in the traditional way. For the biological family, the case being only partially solved created a complex emotional state, where relief at knowing Linda was alive coexisted with disappointment at the lack of clear accountability for what had happened in the past. This justice gap was not a complete absence of truth, but the absence of a punitive legal conclusion, making closure feel incomplete. For the investigative system, acknowledging the limits of justice was a necessary act to ensure honesty and accountability, as pursuing an unsuccessful prosecution would not only waste resources, but also risk further harm to those directly affected by the case. This acknowledgement did not diminish the value of the efforts invested in reopening and confirming the case, but set a clear boundary on what could and could not be achieved when time had taken away the core elements of the legal process. The justice gap thus became a central concept in this phase, not only reflecting the absence of a verdict, but also serving as a reminder of the inherent limits of the system when facing cases prolonged beyond the effective reach of the law. That gap existed alongside the confirmed truth, creating a state where cognitive justice and legal justice did not fully coincide. In this context, clearly communicating the legal limits became an important part of investigative responsibility, to avoid creating unrealistic expectations for the family and the public about the possibility of prosecution or punishment. This transparency, though difficult to accept, helped shape a more realistic understanding of what the system could deliver after decades, while emphasizing that clarifying the truth, even without a verdict, still held its own value in ending prolonged uncertainty. The limits of justice in this case were not the result of indifference or individual failure, but the consequence of the intersection of time, law, and investigative reality, where each factor posed barriers that could not be overcome by will alone. The case being partially solved, thus became an honest conclusion, fully reflecting both what had been achieved and what could not be achieved, leaving a justice gap as an inseparable part of the story, where the truth was known, but could not be fully transformed into justice in the traditional legal sense. The limits of justice acknowledged in the final phase of the case did not close the value of what had been achieved. On the contrary, it highlighted the profound significance of the investigative process in the modern context, where the role of DNA genealogy became the key factor in connecting puzzle pieces once thought impossible to fit. The use of commercial DNA data and genetic genealogy not only enabled the confirmation of Linda Davis's identity after nearly 3 decades missing, but also proved that files previously deemed deadlocked could be revived when technology allowed access to information beyond the limits of traditional investigative methods. DNA genealogy, in this case, did not serve as a single piece of evidence or a magic solution to all problems, but as an unlocking tool, creating a new point of entry for the investigative system to return to old files with different questions, different methods, and higher verification capabilities. The impact of this approach was not limited to one specific case, but extended to the general perception of how cold cases are handled, where individual biological data, when used with proper legal and ethical standards, could become a bridge between past and present. For other cold cases still in the system, this case provided a practical model for combining genetic data with historical records, showing that even when physical evidence was lost and witnesses could no longer provide new information, alternative paths to the truth still existed. This model did not guarantee that every case would be fully solved, but it opened the possibility that at least the victim's identity could be confirmed, ending prolonged anonymity and restoring personhood to those erased from the system for many years. At the societal level, the case carried meaning beyond the criminal investigation scope, as it raised important questions about how society views and handles long-term missing persons cases, especially those involving children, in a context where time is often seen as a factor that blurs collective responsibility. Linda Davis being found alive after many years challenged the assumption that prolonged missing cases inevitably led to tragic outcomes, while emphasizing that each cold case file represented not just an investigative failure, but also an unfinished human story. The societal significance of the case lay in forcing the public and the system to re-evaluate the value of maintaining records, preserving data, and being ready to reopen investigations when new conditions arose, rather than treating archiving as a final end. At the same time, the case also highlighted the ethical and legal challenges accompanying the use of personal DNA data, underscoring the importance of balancing investigative benefits with privacy rights, a balance that could only be achieved with clear legal frameworks and strict oversight. From an investigative perspective, the long-term lesson drawn from the case was not only in applying new technology, but in how the system approached and evaluated data over time, recognizing that what could not be done at one point might become feasible in the future. The cold case unit's ability to restructure files, re-establish scenarios, and narrow investigative scope demonstrated the value of thorough, accurate, and systematic archiving, as the documents preserved from 1992 provided the foundation for connecting with modern DNA data. This lesson emphasized that investigative work served not only the present, but also had to be conducted with the awareness that it could be continued by future generations of investigators with different tools and thinking. The case also clearly showed the boundary between truth and justice, reminding that clarifying a story did not always lead to the ability to punish under the law, but that did not diminish the value of knowing the truth. In this case, confirming identity and reuniting family brought a form of humanistic closure, even though the criminal justice gap remained. The long-term significance of the case therefore lay in the shift of focus from solely seeking the perpetrator to restoring identity, history, and voice to the victim. A goal increasingly valued in the modern approach to cold cases. The Linda Davis case became evidence that even when legal justice was limited by time, cognitive and societal justice could still be achieved through clarifying the truth, reconnecting severed lives, and forcing the system to reevaluate its responsibility toward files once thought forgotten. In that context, the greatest consequence of the case was not in closing a file, but in opening a new understanding of the capabilities of modern investigation, the value of genetic data when used responsibly, and society's long-term obligation not to abandon unanswered questions, even when the final answers did not fully align with traditional expectations of justice. The Linda Davis story shows that life in the United States today is both safer thanks to technology and more fragile because we still easily become complacent out of habit. Delaware in 1992 was so peaceful that adults seeing an abnormal element would reassure themselves and hesitate. Those few minutes of lost supervision were enough to create a gap in the timeline that police could not fill, despite canvassing door-to-door, large-scale searches, police dogs, and suspect lists with no physical evidence to cling to. The first practical lesson is to treat something feels off as a signal to act in parks, parking lots, shopping areas. If a stranger approaches a child, if behavior makes you hesitate, switch to safety mode, keep the child close, call for help, quickly note license plates features, report to security staff. The second lesson is to prepare for worst-case scenarios before they happen. Linda's family only discovered related items while searching, but you can proactively use updated photos, describe daily clothing, set if lost, stand still meeting points, and the rule to call 911 immediately when a child is out of sight. The third lesson lies in the modern era. Commercial DNA broke the deadlock when documents conflicted and birth records were missing. But it also reminds that personal data carries legal and emotional weight. If using it, understand privacy rights, choose reputable platforms, consider sharing, and when unusual results appear, refer to investigative authorities for official verification. Finally, reunion is not an automatic happy ending. Linda had to adjust legal identity, learn to live between two families, and face the justice gap due to statutes of limitations. Therefore, in real life, respect the recovery pace, seek psychological support, and accept that truth can come late, but it is still worth pursuing. If you believe every unsolved cold case file deserves to be fully told like Linda Davis's story, please subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to search for the truth behind years of silence. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where another story is waiting to be brought to light.